But we just lost somebody who was like a pioneer of games from our childhood, something we were talking about this past November too. Why don't you go ahead and bring it in? Because April 2nd was the date of 2026 that we lost someone big in the gaming industry, a pioneer.
Um, I don't know if I'm going to say his name correctly, but Yoshihisa Kishimoto.
Mr. Kishimoto.
He's kind of like the father of the beat 'em ups. And if you grew up in the time when we grew up, I mean, this guy, he created, games like Renegade, Double Dragon, um, River City Ransom series, and even that WWF game.
I was looking up, I actually was looking up a list. Let me run down some of the works he did right now. This is going back into the early 1980s. And actually, one of the first things he was on, do you remember the Laserdisc game Cobra Command where you were the helicopter?
I do remember. I don't remember it on Laserdisc, but I remember the game.
So he was the director on that. And then, as you mentioned, Renegade in the arcade, which was the American version of, I'm going to have to remember what it was called in Japan. But again, a school beat up, because what I read about his history is he actually did get in a lot of fights at school, and he was a big fan of Bruce Lee and martial arts movies. So we can see where some of his ideas came from. But on this list, obviously, Double Dragon, Super Dodgeball.
Yeah, that dude, I played so many hours of that game as a kid.
I remember U.S. Championship Volleyball, never played it, but the name sounds familiar. Of course, we got Double Dragon 2, WWF Superstars, director on there. Then we got Double Dragon 2 and 3, and as you mentioned, WrestleFest. And then as I looked into it, after like 2010, he went into an independent consulting role on a lot of other uh, products, including even like a Cowboy Bebop game for the PlayStation. So, but as you started to, I'll let you take it back over again. He basically, people say Kung Fu. You remember Kung Fu scrolling sideways? They say that was the original side-scrolling beat 'em up, and I guess technically it does scroll side to side, and you do at least punch and kick things. But really, starting with like Renegade and Double Dragon, that was what gave birth to the modern side-scroller. They call them belt scrollers in Japan, beat 'em up type games.
Even if you take like the NES, obviously, when we were kids, we had the big arcade games. Double Dragon was, a monster. You play that everywhere. They had it everywhere. Some of these other games, I think I saw Renegade in, at a liquor store or something at one point. But you didn't see that too much. But like if you look at, so most of these games we played on the NES, right? We played the Renegade was on the NES. Kung Fu, they had a version of it on the NES. And yeah, so if you could say Kung Fu might have been the first, but if you look at like Kung Fu compared to Renegade, I mean, Renegade was like ahead of its time. They had like so many moves. You could punch, you could kick, you can almost like run and lariat people and drop kick them, grab them, throw them, knee them in the groin. I mean, that game was wild. Not as good as the arcade version, but for an NES game, I remember that game used to drive me crazy because it was so hard. Trying to get through it. I think I got to. I don't know if I ever beat it, but I think I got to like the mountain area. Like after where you have to ride the motorcycle and kick the guys off the bike. I don't know if you ever played Renegade.
I did play it. My memory is a little bit hazy on it, but what you said too about did you ever beat it? We're talking about games that were made for the arcade to be quarter munchers too. So that kind of translated too in a lot of these
Yeah.
things. I remember, I remember Renegade in the arcade. I specifically remember the very beginning when you're in the subway and you're beating up on everybody. And then I remember when Double Dragon first came out, and you have this two-player game where anybody can come in and join with you. And then, of course, we played Double Dragon here about a year or so ago, and we just recently beat together Streets of Rage 4 again, which is like, again, we wouldn't have that game without the pioneering works here. But yeah, Double Dragon in the arcade, someone pops in, puts a quarter in, you get to the end of the game, and then it's one-on-one. Suddenly the person you've been fighting side by side with, now you're battling to be the last person standing. And
Well,
I
it's
mean,
funny too because, like, you think about now, like, let's say, let's look at Hideo Kojima for example, right? Like, he's known as this prolific game person, right? So when you hear that he's got a new game coming out, you're like, I'm going to check that game out,
right.
even if it sounds wild. Like the Death Stranding. That game sounded really weird. I was like, like that's a game I probably never would have played if it wasn't by Hideo Kojima, and I decided to give it a shot, and now I love it. You know, but back in those times when we were growing up, like you didn't know who these people were. You know what I mean? Like you didn't know that, oh, the guy that made Renegade also made Double Dragon, so we should get Double Dragon. Like you just had to play the game and and see if you liked it or not. And it's interesting because that guy was responsible for like some of the best games of our childhood, because I'm sure like me, you probably spent a lot of
Yeah,
time in the arcade playing Double Dragon. And then like at home on the consoles, you probably spent a lot of time playing, River City Ransom, because those games were just cool. I never knew it was the same guy. It felt like the same kind of vibe, but like that kind of just goes to show you how good he was. That like you don't even know it was his stuff, and yet it showed through what he made. Same thing with like the wrestling game, like that WrestleFest. That was an awesome
absolutely.
game.
I did look it up, and so the Renegade originally in Japan was Neketsu Koha Kunio-kun. And I know Kunio-kun is what they always refer to as like
Mm-hmm.
like you said, you just mentioned River City Ransom. I know it's one of your favorite games of all time. We've been wanting to play it, haven't gotten to in a while. But yeah, that was so original where you're collecting the coins and everything, and as opposed to just getting points for them, now not only is a beat 'em up, you can actually upgrade and improve your skills. It kind of put that RPG element into it.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, that was one of the early open world games, right?
Because you could backtrack, right? Yeah, you could
Like it
backtrack in
was
that game.
yeah, at its heart, it was a fighting game, but really, like you think about it, like you said, it was an RPG because you had story. You go, the people would talk to you and they tell you, this, you go to this park and this guy's got your girlfriend or whatever. There were the shops that you would go to and you would buy certain
And
food
you
and
buy the manuals for new moves, if I recall correctly.
yeah, and then like you would have to like increase your stats so that you can get to when you get to the harder levels, you can actually beat the gang members. But you can go to those gang members right away. There's nothing stopping you. You just get your butt kicked. You had to kind of like progress. But it was like an open world game, right? Because most of the games back then were, I mean, it doesn't seem very groundbreaking now. But if you think about what games were like back then, I mean, it was just a side-scrolling game. You go through the level, you get to the next
Yeah.
level. There was nothing really like that. That's what made that game so cool. Is that and then like almost like you say the physics of the game. Like you remember, like you can throw the rock, and then like you can hit
That's
it with the
right.
stick
You could
right
almost
back
play
at the
baseball.
person, like things like
Somebody could
that.
hold a
Like
stick, and somebody could throw the rock, and then you could swing the stick
yeah,
at the rock. And I know it depends on the age of the audience watching this, but like that was mind blowing back then. That was almost like, remember how, and this is off topic, we would get amazed by playing a role playing game, and you would get a new helm or a new sword, and you'd equip it, and then your character was holding the sprite changed, and that was like, it's definitely interesting to have seen literally every incarnation and growth in the arcade and video game industry, to think we've been amazed over and over. We were amazed by multiple layer background scrolling, like parallax scrolling. Like, oh my gosh, the trees are moving
yeah,
separate from the front, separate from the mountains. And that was like, how are they pulling this off? And Mode 7 scaling. These games like Double Dragon, it has persisted. I mean, they've had multiple sequels and spin-offs, a lot not as good as the first, but we didn't have all that back then. There wasn't as much advanced capabilities. You relied on the game, on the combat, and he did a great job of bringing what you would watch in a martial arts film to kind of something anybody could pick up and start
mhm.
pushing a few buttons and feel like they're in the middle of that kind of fight. It's just a shame that the future incarnation of Double Dragon never really reached the height of the original, but I think it launched the whole genre, right? Name some games he probably wouldn't have. We wouldn't have the Streets of Rage series. Probably wouldn't have Golden Axe. We
Oh,
wouldn't have which one?
Final Fight,
Obviously Final Fight, yeah. And that was funny because Final Fight actually started off as a
Street Fighter.
sequel to Street Fighter, right? And if it hadn't really kind of backfired on them, what would they have turned it into? They could look at games like Double Dragon and the beat 'em up genre that Capcom had been doing already, and they'd say, okay, we've been doing this, and they wouldn't have been doing that if it hadn't been for what came before. I mean, but that's the kind of cool thing, is we can see all this. You pick up a Double Dragon game now, your kids and your kids look at it and they have no idea what it was like to play something that was never seen before. Now beat 'em ups, everybody's tossing out one, and it's mostly thanks to this man.